presentation.
Great, thanks so much. Do you have, oh, there it is, perfect, okay. Yeah, hi everyone, like Catherine said, my name is Christa and I'm an associate director at E3. And I'm really excited to speak with you all today. In my presentation, I'm going to share some thoughts on the value of V1G and V2G and look at what studies have quantified so far, and then what are the key gaps that we need to address to better incorporate this into utility planning. Next slide, please. So first getting into what studies have quantified so far for the value of VGI. Next slide. So there's many studies out there that have already quantified the value of V1G and V2G, and these have largely focused on two main buckets. The first would be the utility value of V1G and V2G, and that's typically quantified in studies through the avoided energy, capacity, transmission and distribution, and greenhouse gas costs. Other studies have looked at the value that customers can see more directly through bill savings or demand response incentives. And these studies are a really important start to the conversation. As we'll discuss later in the presentation, there's a few key areas where we think we should further study the value of VGI to be able to use it in planning. Next slide. So I wanted to give an example of some results seeing the value of V1G and V2G. And so this is an example from an E3 case study that we did for the potential grid value in 2030 for CAISO, NISO, and ERCOT. And in this study, we saw that V2G can provide significant value beyond just V1G. And in this case, I'm referring to V1G as more just managed charging, shifting charging load based on different price signals, whereas V2G is actually discharging back to the grid. And in this example, we base the analysis on wholesale energy prices, wholesale capacity in each market, and transmission and distribution values in the different regions. And so in addition to finding that V2G could generate a lot more value, we also saw that this also really depends on the baseline you're using. So in this example, we had used a baseline where many drivers were already responding to time of use rates in their different regions. And so the V1G value was a bit limited because drivers were already pretty responsive to their TOU rate signals. And so the additional value that they could generate based on shifting their charging behavior in direct response to the wholesale price signals was a bit limited in that sense. And then a second key finding that was in this study, the very large values we see in CAISO and NISO were driven by high potential transmission and distribution deferral values in areas of those ISOs. And so this is a value that we want to dig into a lot further, and that'll be an example we get into in later slides. So while we have a lot of studies that are quantifying the value of VGI in terms of different price signals and the grid value and the customer value, we really need to move that further a bit to be able to show that V1G and V2G are predictable and reliable. So we need to focus in on how VGI can be a resource at the right time, at the right certainty, and in the right place. And so this is a key next step to be able to really demonstrate that VGI can be a resource in utility planning models. Next slide. So looking briefly at how we can move this into language that utilities speak and be able to demonstrate the value of VGI. Next slide. So a key update to these studies that we'll need to be able to show the value of VGI is to really show how VGI can perform as a resource under extreme conditions. So utilities use probabilistic models to evaluate lots of different scenarios and have different metrics that resources need to be able to meet. And so we really need to show that VGI can support these different extreme conditions to see what its true value might be. And so part of this will be looking at VGI in the language that utilities speak. So looking at loss of load probability, expected unserved energy, and effective load carrying capacity. Next slide. And again, utilities use probabilistic modeling for reliability planning. And so we need to see how VGI can be a part of that modeling ecosystem. So first, when utilities are developing their model, the loss of load probability model, and all of the data and different load scenarios, weather scenarios, resource outage conditions that go into that, we ultimately need to see how VGI can actually support the overall reliability contribution and how it can play alongside other resources. Next slide. So I won't go into this table in a lot of detail, but at a high level here, what we wanted to look at is how can we define VGI in terms that utility planners use. So we need to be able to compare it to other resources side by side. And for resources like thermal generation or energy storage, we have these metrics already established. But what does max output or max duration mean for VGI? And so we think a key next step with VGI value studies is being able to actually demonstrate what a VGI resource, so maybe a fleet of 1,000 EVs, what that actually looks like and how that compares to more traditional resources. So digging into one of the areas where we think that different VGI studies can evolve is looking at the reliability contribution. So this would be getting at how VGI can be a resource at both the right time and with the right level of certainty to be able to provide value to the grid. So the time of day that load is added or that resources can support the grid is really important to reliability, particularly during critical reliability hours. So the heat map on the right here is a loss of load heat map, where the darker red colors show a higher probability of a loss of load event. And this example is for a case study that E3 recently did in California. So in 2024, we're seeing that the critical reliability hours are in the summer months and in the late afternoon, early evening, when solar is coming offline and the duck curve has a steep ramp rate. That's when we're seeing the highest probability of loss of load events. And so the dark red on this map can show how V1G and V2G can provide value in today's grid in California. EVs should avoid charging during those dark red hours, and V2G could provide value, provide reliability contribution by discharging to the grid during those dark red hours. So VGI can provide value throughout the year, but it really needs to be responsive to these critical hours in order to provide that reliability component of its value. And so a key takeaway with this is that we need to be able to evolve our thinking about VGI as the grid evolves. So the heat map on the left here is for 2024 in that California case study, and same one that we saw on the previous slide. The heat map on the right here is our analysis for 2031. And we can see that there's a pretty big shift in the critical reliability hours. So nighttime actually becomes the higher chance of loss of load events. So as more solar and storage are added to the grid, that area where we need additional resources actually is expected to shift to the nighttime. And so VGI will need to evolve with those grid needs to be able to actually provide that reliability support rather than sticking to the same patterns that we would see today. Next slide. So getting into the actual results we saw with our modeling, looking at how V1G and V2G can support, we're first going to look at V1G, so just shifting the time of day that the charging occurs. So we have 3 dispatch charts here on the left. The first one is the base case where we have, we just assume unmanaged charging. We assume vehicles are not charging according to any price signal. And the red sections there are showing time where there's expected unserved energy. So during these critical reliability days, we're seeing a loss of load event occur on the first 3 days of this dispatch chart. And this is for 2031. And so we first looked at V1G, where using today's overall thought that we should shift EV charging to the nighttime. And so in that case, in 2031, because we saw that the critical reliability hours are actually overnight, we see that just shifting charging to nighttime using time of use rates actually increases the expected unserved energy. But then in the third example, we look at V1G, where we shift the charging to the daytime to be able to soak up excess solar, and that decreases the EUE and actually resolves that third loss of load event that we see in day 3 of this dispatch chart. So in this example, we can see how V1G can support reliability, but it really needs to be responsive to the grid conditions and just be very responsive to the actual critical reliability hours. Next slide. And so looking at V2G, we see that V2G can provide even greater reliability support. So the top chart here is, again, the base case example where we had unmanaged charging, and we see a loss of load event on the first 3 days of this series. And then in the bottom chart, we have a new green section here, which is V2G discharging to the grid. And we see that it's able to resolve that third loss of load event, and then it decreases the EUE by about 25%. And in this example, we actually had a fixed shape for the V2G pattern. If we have that dispatched more dynamically, have the model actually optimize V2G, we could provide even more reliability improvements. So the key takeaway here is that both V1G and V2G can help with reliability, but need to evolve based on the changing grid and be very responsive to the grid's critical reliability hours. And so the other component that we wanted to dig into in more detail in future studies is looking at the distribution value of VGI. So as I mentioned in the example we had at the start of the presentation, T&D deferral value was a really high component of the value we saw for V2G in both California and New York. But we want to dig into this further to see how VGI can actually provide this value and how reliable it is at providing that. And so this will help us get at all the right time of VGI response, the right certainty, and in the right place. So with utility distribution planning processes, typically begin with long-term planning scenarios, and then look at spatial allocation using utility data and geospatial data, and then use distribution planning software to dig into this at more granular levels. And so with VGI, we want to look at specifically where EVs are being adopted, where chargers being adopted, and then what time of day are EVs charging, so that we can compare that to other effects on the distribution system and see the key areas where VGI could potentially provide value. And so E3 has been working on distribution planning studies, looking really granularly at the adoption propensity and then the spatial allocation of EV adoption and also charger adoption. And so here's a couple examples from a study in Atlanta. And so these charts show the level 2 home charger adoption based on overall adoption propensity in Atlanta. And this will be a key input for distribution planning studies and where we could potentially look at the value of V2G on the distribution system, because we need to know where charging is occurring really precisely on the grid to be able to see if it's able to provide that deferral value. Next slide. And another example would be looking at, so the prior slide was looking at home charger adoption. We can also look at DC fast charger adoption. This will be less relevant to looking at V2G value, since likely public DC fast chargers wouldn't really be performing V2G, but this can help look at the actual distribution costs that charger adoption might incur by looking at different deployments along highways and at rest stops. And so we're doing a lot more analysis on this to see where we expect these chargers to show up and help us with the overall costs of the distribution system. Next slide. So just to summarize with a few recommendations, so in terms of being able to further study and then unlock VGI value, we think that looking at the capacity value of VGI is a really key component. Being able to speak the same language that utilities and regulators use, like loss of load probability, expected unserved energy, and ELCC, so that we can compare VGI alongside other resources and better understand what that actual value might be. We also recommend that utilities work with automakers and aggregators to get real data from the different pilots so that they can incorporate EV charging and V1G and V2G into the probabilistic modeling of extreme events. And then also working on expanded demonstrations so that we can coordinate with the different parties involved and move from that pilot phase to more full-blown programs. So thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Christa. Really appreciate that. I've got a few questions, but I will wait to our Q&A time after. Next, we have Jonathan Levy with Kaluza for the next presentation. Jonathan is the managing director at Kaluza, and prior to joining, Jonathan was the chief commercial officer at EVgo, which is one of the largest electric vehicle charging networks in the US. Prior to joining EVgo, Jonathan was the director of policy and strategy at sustainable investing firm in Colorado and started his career in Washington, D.C. in public service, working both for a member of Congress and in a variety of positions in President Obama's administration, including as deputy chief of staff to the U.S. Secretary of Energy at the time. So with that, Jonathan, I will turn it over to you for your 15-minute presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner Paratek. And not surprisingly, I'm going to agree a lot with what Christa just said, but I do want to take a slightly different focus point. I think in a lot of the conversations, especially around V2X, we talk a lot about the need for standardization, for where we need to be on equipment readiness and certification. All of those things are extremely, extremely important. But I think it's really important for all of us, especially in the policy world, to make sure that we are centering the customer. And so when we talk about all the V2s, right, V2G, V2L, V2H, V2B, V2X, we should also be making sure we're thinking about V2C, where the C is the customer, because if the customers aren't happy, none of this is going to work. So if we can go to the next slide. All right, thank you. Sorry, I've got a couple different screens going on here, so it's a little bit hard for me. A little quick background on Kaluza. So Kaluza is a B2B software solutions company. We partner with utilities around the world to deliver solutions for the energy transformation. And so that includes on the flexibility side, managed EV charging, which will be our focal point today. But we also do a great deal of work with our core billing product, and CIS, full meter to cash solutions, all of those things. And if you're wondering how that's relevant to V2X, I'll come back to it. But we spun out of a company called OVO, the third largest energy retailer in the United Kingdom. And we have a presence around the world. Earlier this year, AGL in Australia signed a contract with us to migrate all 4 million of their residential meters to our billing platform. As well as AGL invested $100 million US into Kaluza as we continue to grow around the world. So as we think about this connective tissue between managed charging and other flexibility optimization and the core systems, why does that matter? Some of that matters because there are all sorts of utilities and energy retailers that are trying to transform, and their legacy software systems aren't able to keep up. There are some times that you want to test a new tariff, or you want to roll out new offerings or propositions to your customers. And with some of the legacy software, that can be something that takes 6, 12, 18 months. and lots of money. And so with a more agile, modern billing platform and one that can connect visibility between the CIS and the ADMS sides of the house, you can actually be able to dispatch those resources, and you can test more quickly and innovate. Again, that's also relevant to our overall thesis of who's one of the more important stakeholders that often is not thought about in this, and that is, again, the customer. So I'll quickly hit the next slide, because this group knows better than anybody that the world is changing. And instead of customers only being at the end of the solution here, they are now at the center. So you have customers that are obviously, yes, still taking energy from the grid, but now they're generating with distributed solar generation. They're storing with batteries, whether those are stationary systems or mobile systems. And all of that means that if we're going to have a really modern, resilient, and decarbonized energy system, whether we're talking about avoiding local distribution impacts or we're talking about delivering great customer experiences for both resiliency and flexibility, then the customer is going to have to be integrated. They're going to have to be part of the solution for getting off of peak demand, being able to respond to critical grid events, and all of that is going to require better software solutions. So again, we'll flip through a couple more slides here. I promise to be quick on some of these. Again, I've kind of already alluded to this, so we can go to the next one. So I want to talk a little bit about some of what we've done in the past, and then bring it back to that customer experience. So a couple of years ago, Kaluza launched in partnership with OVO Energy, Nissan, and Indra, a V2G program in the UK, where we had 330 Nissan Leafs with Indra bidirectional CHAdeMO chargers. And we were trying to both validate it technically as well as make sure it worked for the utility, in this case, OVO, and the customer, not to mention the benefits to the grid. So if you go to the next one, the next slide here, it's going to give you a look into our control room. And we use this both for the V1G managed charging systems, as well as the V2G, the bidirectional. This is a little bit of a zoom in of the broader system. But the point being, our real-time control room enables us to see when our customer is actively charging, when are they exporting back to the grid, when are they idle, and then obviously if they're not plugged in, they're driving around someplace or they're parked somewhere else. Now, what this tells us is that we can see real benefits to the grid itself in avoiding peaks, having that discharge match what Christa was showing, where you want the discharging from the battery to be happening when it's either most expensive or most in demand, and the importing happening off peak. But it also gives us great data and visibility if customers actually responded to this. And so if we skip ahead 2 slides here, because there's just a couple other things that we don't need to necessarily get into here, let's go right to what was the bottom line for customers. Individual customers were saving hundreds of dollars. In fact, at the high end, people were saving $900-ish a year. These customers are still, most of them are still using their bidirectional charger in their system here. We saw massive amounts of CO2 saved. We saw really this 3 million miles of free based on what they were offsetting their discounted charging rate for with selling back. But for this conversation, let's focus on the fact that there was a 93% satisfaction rate from the customers in a post-trial survey, and they kept going. So if we skip ahead and we think about the learnings from this, and we can go one more slide just because it's going to highlight the right column here, there were a lot of things that we were trying to test and we learned were barriers to scale here. Again, I've already made some allusions to bidirectional charging, availability of the equipment itself, all the standards. But from the customer perspective, they had some specific questions and concerns that we wanted to both address and then see what else was out there. And in fact, if you go to the next slide, one of the biggest things that was quite a surprise in a positive way was before the trial started, the 2 biggest concerns that we heard from customers that were enrolling in this program to do bidirectional charging, where they were really worried about battery degradation, and they were worried that the savings would actually materialize. They did not think that what we were telling them was going to be the case, but they lived it. And so what matters here is that these particular customers came in with these 2 fundamental concerns around, is it going to hurt my car? And will I actually save money, or is this just going to be a waste of time and a waste of upfront outlay if they spent any money on the charger? And in both cases, we were able to bust those myths by learning and by actual doing. So after this trial, we decided we wanted to take things one step further and go do some surveying in partnership with some other folks in the ecosystem. So moving to the next slide. We wanted to do a couple of these things here, but we'll go one more slide just because this is where I'm used to clicking through myself. We did this in partnership with Kaluza, OVO, Indra, and this time Volkswagen, especially as the ID3 and ID4 very popular in Europe, the ID4 very popular in the US. We wanted to dig into potential customers. And so this time around, building on the real life observations we had in the OVO V2G trial, we said, let's go do survey data and take customers through a mock-up of enrollment, and they had to go through this process of, hey, if you were going to enroll in this program, here's a bunch of survey questions that were like they were doing an actual enrollment, and we took away some really interesting insights. So we'll go to the next slide. And we found that there was a diversity of reasons that people were picking an EV, that there were a lot of them who, again, like the top right, were concerned about battery health. A lot of them were concerned about cost, but the bottom right one is the one that I'm most concerned about, which is that only 20% of them said they were interested in a V2X proposition. Now, some of that can be explained as, they're not aware of it. In fact, when I was speaking at a conference last year of energy engineers, I was really surprised when I was talking about V2X that the very first question I got in a very educated forum was, wait, are you telling me the electrons can flow back to the grid from the charger? And so we clearly have a lot of this education to do. And if customers aren't convinced, to Christa's point, that there is a benefit for them, which means having the right tariff, that they know the interconnection processes, that they're easy, that we can get the costs down on the bidirectional charger, and that they're just aware of all the benefits this can have for them, for the grid, for the planet, we're not going to be able to deliver on all the great things that all of us want. So we go to the next slide. What does that actually mean for all of us? And I would venture it means that we have to be doing more demonstration projects and more education in partnership with utilities, with automakers, and with software and other technology solutions providers like Kaluza. So if you go to the next slide, from the Kaluza perspective, we're trying to lead by example here, not only what we've done in the UK and what we're looking to do elsewhere across the world, but right here in our own backyard. And so we've got this program under the Redwoods funding opportunity in California from the California Energy Commission, where of the 330 vehicles we'll be doing in this VGI project, 30 of them will be V2X. And we expect most of that initial cohort to be V2H. If we're being really honest with ourselves, we see that that's where the automakers have been moving in their marketing, whether you're talking about the camping commercials that we've seen for the Super Bowl or just in general, as well as the delays in UL certification and market availability mean that that's going to be where everybody is focused at the onset, but that can still be really important for load shifting, for resilience, and for, again, customer education, because we're going to have to bring people along and make sure that this is inclusive and helping out those across income and geographic spreads, and not only those with the most expensive vehicles in the highest income zip codes. Going to the next slide. Beyond that, we also know that we need to keep working with automakers. So we've been doing direct integrations, for example, with Volvo and OVO. What we have done is put the API directly into the Volvo app, so customers don't need an additional barrier. They don't need to use a Kaluza or an OVO app to enroll in their managed charging program. And we're gonna have more news coming on that soon on V2X specifically. But the concept being that VGI has to be simple, it has to be accessible, it has to be ready to go for their customers, and the automakers are going to be one of the most trusted parties for those end customers, even more so than sometimes their own utility. And one of the things that I want to tie it back to is, at the beginning, I talked about billing systems, right? And whether you're the automaker, you're the utility, you're the software provider, again, the customer has to be happy with all of us. And the need for that defined value prop means being able to move quickly, being able to say, hey, here's what's going on. So as utilities are coming out with new tariffs, right? PG&E has a new tariff. There's a lot of new variable tariffs. There'll be more moves towards real-time pricing in the future. We know that that can take a really long time on legacy software systems. What we've been doing in Australia has been finding these needs that OVO Energy Australia and now AGL have, and saying, okay, how do we address real-time dynamics in the wholesale markets, and how do we shift? There was a period of time last year where suddenly, based on negative pricing, home generation was costing the OVO a lot of money, OVO Energy Australia a lot of money. And so we shifted to this new solar plan where you could just soak up a lot of that sun and shift it including to EV charging and other things. And we put these new propositions, brand new tariffs to go to customers out in matters of days or weeks rather than months or years. And that meant giving the customers value. It meant giving the wholesaler value. It meant giving the grid a huge bit of value in a way that was much quicker than expected and delivered something that gave the great customer satisfaction, all in something that was already in the palm of their hand, working in the apps, integrating to their daily use. So I've kind of been yammering. Hopefully that was helpful from our perspective at Kaluza. Our job is to make sure that we're empowering the utilities and automaker partners to deliver what customers need. And I think in all of the V2X conversation, that customer has to be centered, they have to be happy, and they have to be educated, and we have to do that all together.
That's fantastic. It's really interesting to hear these actual, real life examples of where this has been put into place. We talk about this a lot in theory, so I'm fascinated to hear about these real results and to hopefully dive in with some questions after our final presentation. But we will go to our final presentation first, the last 15 minutes here, and we have Jordan Smith from Southern California Edison for the final presentation. Jordan, I didn't receive a bio for you, so I'll have you introduce yourself in your presentation.
Okay, very good. See if we can get things going here. Yep, I am with Southern California Edison Company, and let's see, I am with our Grid Technology Innovation Group, and I've been with the company about 28 years and have a lot of experience with electric vehicles and EV charging systems, energy storage systems, that type of thing. Currently, I am the chief engineer for SCE for our EPIC program, which is our electric program investment charge program, which funds technology deployment demonstrations. Let's see if we can get some slides up here.
Jordan, if you could share your screen, that way we could see your slides.
Yeah, working on that. Sharing screen. Entire screen. All right, looks like that's working. All right, very good. So just a brief bit about Southern California Edison. Southern California, 50,000 square miles, 5 million customers. Setting the stage a bit, SCE's just published a recent follow-on paper that explains the steps needed to help meet the state's greenhouse gas reduction, carbon-free energy goals by 2045. Quite some potentially appearing to be daunting tasks, such as electrifying 90% of vehicles, including 75% of medium and heavy-duty vehicles. One of the key things we're looking at is, as you've heard from other presenters today, is the potential for VGI to provide some either resources or effects which can benefit the grid. According to some of our studies, we're seeing that VGI could potentially be a very large resource with what could be up to 2 gigawatts of V2G, load shedding capability, such as demand response, anticipating 65% managed charging by 2045. So what does that look like from a system perspective? We basically look at sort of the unmanaged case and the managed case, and the difference is could be substantial. But one of the things that we work on in the technical field is how do we bring that managed case to a state of certainty, as you heard from some of the other speakers. So I'm going to talk a bit specifically about a project that SC is running right now, and looking forward to questions around either specifics or broadened topics that the other speakers were presenting. But this project is something that we envisioned some years back, and the basic premise for the project was the so-called V2G AC model, AC referring to the case where the inverter that interacts with the grid and provides all of those functions is on board the vehicle, in contrast to DC systems where the inverter based resource is in a fixed position, and that has some implications for things like interconnection and compliance with grid safety and support codes. So that was the original premise of the idea. The idea being also that a V2G AC system could potentially have advantages for customers when it comes to cost, vehicles, all of which commercial vehicles certainly have onboard charger inverters already for basic functions. And so with relatively minor changes, that system could become a V2G system. The EVSE portion, which becomes the interconnected device that's fixed in place and performs some new oversight functions that have been worked out in this project, which I'll speak about, is potentially similar in cost to a networked smart charger. The other thing that we did with this project, since it was originally conceived, SCE has been implementing a modernized grid management system, which consists of an ADMS and DERMS platform. And so we have extended to this project the connection to communication with SCE's DERMS platform. So kind of working in parallel. So the basic objectives of the project demonstrate interconnection processes and advance the standards that can do that. Work with automakers, charger makers to demonstrate those standards and those systems in the lab in a validation and refinement effort. Once those systems are demonstrated, and those standards are established, then those systems and practices can be taken up in interconnection rulemakings, such as the Rule 21 process in California. We also are demonstrating, as mentioned, connection to and interaction with SCE's DERMS platform, which first release of which was made available within SCE in spring of this year. And we are pioneering the use of that system in connection with IEEE 2030.5 to VGI or V2G aggregators. We are also demonstrating the use of these systems, both AC and DC, to provide resiliency functions during an outage, and how those systems transition back and forth between connected or parallel and islanded or isolated modes. Okay, it's a bit of the architecture description, communication architecture of the systems that I've been talking about, and how the SCE communications and control platforms connect ultimately to these systems, the aggregators of these systems, and implement whatever processes or procedures are required from initial registration, provisioning, and commissioning to the full distribution of controls. So this does describe here both AC and DC systems, and I'll get into a little bit more about specifics. So I mentioned one of the key things that this project is working on is advancing the standards that are necessary to enable V2G as standard, widespread, easily accessed and used systems. So here's just a list of some of the standards activity that the project is involved with. And I'll particularly mention the SAE J3072 standard, which is the V2G AC standard at SAE. Most recent revision published recently, which aligns with the interconnection codes that I was mentioning. Also, UL 1741 SC standard, which is a new standard that was developed, and a lot of the input for that came from this project. That standard applies to the AC EVSE, and there was a lot of work and a lot of theory that was established with the working group here, established this new standard, which is to be published in the early part of next year, and it really lays out how a SAE J3072 certified vehicle and a UL 1741 SC certified EVSE can connect together and interoperate, allowing features such as roaming and providing for the safety and control aspects of that are required in the interconnection codes. Here is a diagram that explains the lab setup that comes together to demonstrate all of these standards and processes, and showed some pictures in the background earlier, and this is really what's behind those images. And this shows the AC system. We have a V2G EV that is provided by partner Stellantis that has the AC onboard bidirectional inverter. We have a Eaton V2G EVSE, and we have a smart load center, and all of these systems provide the functions of both the V2G parallel and V2G isolated or backup power functions, together with our controls, grid simulator, and our data acquisition systems. So I'll talk a little bit about, I won't go into details here, and this is just an example, just showing the controls that are involved with activating and operating various V2G functions. And so a lot of work was done here together, again, with the standards and the automakers to demonstrate how these systems can function and provide the grid functions, grid support functions that are required for interconnection. So some of the basic principles that the project is demonstrating when a SAE J3072 EV connects to a interconnected EVSE certified to UL 1741 SC, there is some basic communications established because this system architecture does allow roaming. There's some communication between the EV and the EVSE that determines whether the EV is a certified V2G AC system and whether it's approved to function. Then there is some, if that is true, then there is some communications around the local grid settings that are required at that point. For example, the various grid support curves that are required at that particular location, and the vehicle then stores those and functions in accordance. If all of that turns out correct, then the system is then eligible to activate V2G functions. So this has all been worked out quite extensively over the past couple of years with standards and demonstrated in the lab. One of the things that we did with the project that's been very helpful is we established the tab, the V2G tab. And maybe some on this call have joined in. If you'd like to join, just send me a note. We just did have a presentation at the V2G forum in Detroit on the latest on both the project and the tab. And we're going to schedule a full tab overview session in the next few weeks. So the tab was established basically to communicate out about what's happening with the SC V2G project and to receive feedback from others that are working on V2G projects or working in the standards arena. And it's proven to be very helpful in doing both. And one of the things that the tab did, since it is a independent functioning body, is the volunteers decided to take up some relevant gaps or areas requiring action to accelerate V2G. And so the group decided to establish 3 working groups, 3 subgroups that would focus on these immediate gaps. The first gap being what we call the area of harmonization, or commonly called DC V2G, but not restricted to DC. This group looks at the various standards. I talked through the AC V2G standards as an example, but there are standards internationally, and how does this all harmonize together and work the way it's supposed to do across borders? So that is an important step in the standards arena. The other thing that this group looks at is sort of how to handle requests or controls from various different parties, how you look at the actors involved. I heard one of the other speakers talk about the importance of the customer, and that's certainly something that's taken up here. So somebody has a V2G system in their home, for example, and they may be signed up for different programs and getting requests from many different actors, an aggregator, a utility, but the customer may have primary interest as far as energy usage and vehicle usage. So how do you harmonize all of these disparate entities and potentially conflicting controls coming in? The second area is cybersecurity, and so the group here is focusing on immediate concerns with cybersecurity that could hinder adoption and use of V2G. So this is a very serious issue, more serious when it comes to interconnected systems or inverter-based generation, as we would call it in the utility industry. And when that connects to the grid, making sure that those systems are cyber secure becomes higher importance because of the potential impact of those systems. So this group has done a really good job of interfacing with national labs and top industry experts to identify some immediate concerns and make some recommendations around cybersecurity, particularly focused on what we would call the man-in-the-middle type vector, with the EVSE being at the center of that. So very good work there. The third group is the AC V2G group, and this is really looking at, again, the issues between standards and requirements. So standards such as 15.11.8, IEEE 2030.5, and the grid codes such as interconnection codes, Rule 21. So work that needs to be done there. So that's all I have. I have a lot of slides, a lot of stuff. Looking forward to whatever questions might arise from the group, and I can focus in on a particular area of interest.
Thanks, Jordan. I appreciate it. Okay, so at this point, we'll bring all 3 of our speakers back on camera. So, and you can stop sharing there, Jordan. And yep. We'll open it up for Q&A. So for all of the participants on the call, I haven't seen any unanswered questions in the chat yet. There have been a few back and forths there, which is great. But feel free to raise your hand and get in line to ask these speakers some questions. I'll maybe start off with a first question for Jonathan. Could you talk a little bit about what the customers actually saw from your V2G program in the UK that you were describing? like what did the customer actually do? How did they have to adjust their lives or adjust their charging behaviors as a result of the pilot?
Yeah, it's a great question. I probably should have given a little bit more context on that. This actually applies both to the V2G program that we have done and still are doing, and the Charge Anytime program that we're doing in the UK with OVO, which has over 20,000 vehicles currently enrolled and actively managed. The way it works is, I think, as you all know, UK energy prices are far higher and far more volatile than we tend to see in the US. And so what both of these programs do is they give the customer a fixed per kWh rate for their charging. So the active managed charging rate, the Charge Anytime program, it's just 7 pence per kilowatt hour. And you contrast that with, it can be much, much higher than that. Like the base one can be around 40 pence, and then it goes much higher based on volatility. And what the customer has to do is basically enroll and cede control of exactly when the car charges. But in exchange, what they get is they set their ready by time, they set their minimum state of charge. And so if the customer says, hey, it needs to be, it can't ever go below 20% and it has to be at least above 80 by 6 a.m., then we control through the back end when it charges and discharges to optimize against that. So for the bidirectional, the V2G program, they had both a very low rate on what they were paying per kWh, and then they also got compensated at a higher rate for the export amount. And the V2G case, they also got the charger for free since it was partially a project that we were doing. That's not sustainable for the business model, but for learning it is, and we're going to be doing something similar to that in the Redwoods program. So the customer gets the equipment on the bidirectional side. The customer gets a very low and predictable rate on the offtake side, and then on the charging back side, on the discharge side, they get money, they get revenue for that. And what they have to do in exchange is, none of us, given that everybody's car sits idle 90% of the time, when it's parked overnight and you're sleeping, I know that I don't care if my car is charging at 11 p.m. or 1 a.m. But since Pepco doesn't have a great tariff for me, I'm guessing when I think it's best for me to be scheduling my charge. Whereas with Kaluza and OVO, what we've done is said we will optimize it against carbon curves, prices, and other things, and the customer, they get the benefit without having to think about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks. I guess one other question for you, Jonathan. You said that battery degradation concerns were the biggest thing at the beginning of the pilot, and then those concerns dissipated at the end of the pilot. What caused that dissipation of concerns? Like, did people actually measure their battery degradation? Did you measure it for them? I assume that the program didn't go on long enough for them to actually notice any sort of degradation. Or what sort of measurement was there, and what was that communication with the customers on battery degradation?
Yeah, great question. It was a 3-year program, and so that it did give it a sufficient amount of time. I think these, especially when you think about those early generations of Leafs that didn't have active cooling, a lot of customers had issues with battery degradation regardless of what they were doing. And so the fact that they did not see material impacts over a 3-year window is what ameliorated that concern for them.
Okay, interesting. And is 3 years long enough to actually see impacts?
Yeah, so there's also a broader question, and I got the same question at the V2G forum, and so I'm going back to the team that was working on this, that worked with Nissan, because Nissan always looked at degradation as well when they were doing these types of projects. So I'm going to find out what the actual numbers were to see what the impacts were. But given that folks that were on 2- and 3-year leases on Leafs were seeing some issues just from regular consumption and discharge, I think 3 years is a sufficient amount of time. If we see what's been happening now with automakers, like Kia with the EV9 talking a lot about bidirectional and being comfortable with daily charge and discharge, I think gives a lot of confidence. And in fact, from where I sit, the fact that all of the automakers have shifted, where 5 years ago, none of them except for Nissan wanted to do bidirectional, and now they all talk about home battery backup and marketing value. I think that shows both the fact that they know customers want it and the fact that they've gotten much more comfortable, with some exceptions, over these last few years.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really good observation. And just that need for resilience too, I think is a really big driver for that. So yeah, no, thanks. Really appreciate that follow up. I'm really curious about that. Ryan.
Yeah. Hey, thanks to all three of you for these presentations. Super helpful. So I'm with the North Carolina Utilities Commission. I work on electric transportation issues. And this is a customer related question, so it's related to the things that were talked about, but I'm curious if any of you have an opinion on it. So in North Carolina, Duke Energy has a pilot around V2G, and it's using the Ford F-150 Lightnings, customers who have leased those, and we're having trouble with enough enrollment to even have the pilot take off. And so just curious from your perspective, you know, what's happening across the country, which vehicle manufacturers, is there enough volume of customers to kind of get the results that Jonathan, for example, you saw, I think you said with the Nissan Leaf in Europe, and so what, you know, how much of a barrier is that, the availability of enough customers, you know, buying or leasing bidirectional vehicles, and also the charging equipment that goes along with it? Are we seeing progress or not in different parts of the country? That's my question.
Yeah, I'm happy to start and others can chime in. I think your question has a lot of really interesting subcomponents to it. One is in Europe, you know, for example, we're doing a project with Volvo where Volvo is doing onboard AC V2G, and that's not an option currently in the US, right? And so if you think about the barrier to entry for the customer, not only is there more model availability, but if you have the capacity, the capability on board, the customer doesn't need to spend as much on an expensive bidirectional DC piece of equipment, and that helps broaden out that availability. I'm not going to relitigate all of that here, and that's a broader conversation that needs to continue happening. But it's an interesting observation that when you think about upfront barriers to adoption, that upfront cost is much larger on a DC system, and getting guidance from local utilities on what the interconnect processes, all of those things are really important parts of it. But in terms of which automakers, are there enough cars that are capable? I would say that the answer is not yet, but they're coming, right? So when I was in Munich earlier this year at the Reuters Europe Automotive, or whatever they called it, everybody was talking about bidirectional, and the model numbers are coming much higher. So, you know, I mentioned the Kia EV9 earlier because they've been very actively marketing their bidirectional V2H capability. Even my car, my Ioniq 5, is V2L capable. I think there's not a lot of, there are a lot of cars out there that are V2L capable. The way that Ford decided to go about it with Sunrun, I think made sense at the time, but because it's one car, which you can use one system, you're kind of constraining yourself to a closed ecosystem, as opposed to what's coming next with all the cars, all the chargers, is, you know, you're doing things through a standards-based open system, so anybody can use any vehicle with any charger. That's going to be one of the massive solves here, so that you're not talking about you can only do it with one type of equipment. But we have to be honest with ourselves that one of the other issues that most folks that want to use that Ford and Sunrun system are having is, do they need to do an upgrade? Do they have enough capacity on their home panel? And there's some other folks out there trying to solve that through different software management. But we need to think about it in terms of cost, timing, and technology. You need the vehicles, but we have the home panel upgrade challenge. If I didn't answer your question directly, by the way, my view is right now there aren't enough cars, but they're coming really soon. And so we should be working on these programs now and doing, you know, it's kind of a version of what I said in the chat. We have plenty of V1G cars that we should just be doing a ton of projects and scaling those now. And we should be doing a bunch of pilots and ramping for when this wave of bidirectional cars comes next.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's helpful to hear your perspective on that. Thanks.
Christa or Jordan, any other perspectives on that? No.
Well, just maybe a couple things. You know, V2G is not a new idea. You know, I was working on doing V2G studies, you know, back in the 2000 era, late 90s, with, you know, the Willett Kempton team, where he used our 350 EVs in our EV fleet and modeled them on V2G use cases. And that was later sort of the basis for one of the biggest V2G projects, the LA Air Force Base V2G pilot. So there is still some technical work to evolve, particularly with the new communication and control system platforms. And but it's always been a chicken and egg thing, that, you know, the automakers are hesitant to add features if they're uncertain that their customers are going to see that as something that they're willing to invest in. So I think we're starting to see some of that. I think the automakers are seeing that the the resiliency or backup power use case is something that's attractive to customers, and it's kind of where we're starting. And pilots like this Redwoods pilot are going to be good to kind of spur things and allow people to get data. What's the customer adoption and effectiveness, and how do utilities interact with these systems? So I think we've got an opportunity to see how things advance here.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Commissioner Rubin.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. This has been a really great discussion. So, Jordan, I appreciated that you had a reference to one of the tab priorities was cybersecurity, and I'm starting to get some questions about this. So I'm wondering from, utility perspectives, what are you hearing about cybersecurity? And do you have any kind of responses about how V2G can work and address cybersecurity issues? Just a general question, and if you have any thoughts on how I can help respond to them.
Yeah, just there's a lot of stuff going on here. Just briefly, SCE is really spearheading a lot of this work, not just on the V2G side, which I kind of tried to explain was potentially a more impactful risk, but in the general EV charging VGI space, SCE was ordered by the California Public Utilities Commission a couple years back to take up this issue on behalf of the IOUs in California. And so that work is in progress right now. SCE is working on that project to analyze the environment, and when it comes to not just EV charging hardware, but also service providers, and analyze that environment, look at the appropriate standards and requirements, and then make recommendations on closing that gap. So good that SCE is sort of on the forefront there, and hoping to have some good recommendations coming out of this work that SCE is doing on behalf of the PUC. But there's a lot of integrated activity in not only our projects that we're running. We have dedicated cybersecurity projects that we're running now, but we also look at incorporating cybersecurity into all our projects in sort of cyber-informed engineering practices, and interface a lot with the DOE, particularly the VTO, and I participate on the grid integration technical team there as well. So hoping a lot of this comes together with improving standards and making recommendations on what needs to be done and who needs to do it.
That's great. Christa or Jonathan, anything that you wanted to add on cybersecurity? No?
Nothing from me. Thanks.
Other than it's important, not really.
Absolutely, I know. So always important to be thinking about that as we continue to become a more and more connected society. So, okay, well, I think with that, I'll end the Q&A. I'll maybe one last opportunity if anyone wants to chime in with one final question. Okay, hearing none. Thank you so much to all three of you for coming and presenting to the EV State Working Group today. All three of your presentations were really valuable, and I think gave us a lot to think about in terms of V2G, V1G, and VGI, and all of the other acronyms as we're trying to tackle this from the Commission. So appreciate you taking the time to come and present to us today. Thank you, all three.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Okay, so